Hello, and welcome to another program in our lineup for Sustainability Awareness Week here at FIT. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Daniel Benkendorf, and I am an associate professor of psychology here at FIT. And we have a whole bunch of live and pre-recorded programming going on this week. And so I hope you will take advantage and check out our schedule. There are many opportunities to get involved on campus as well. And one of the goals of Sustainability Awareness Week each year is to increase engagement on campus. And so we're hoping to do that. Today's session is titled Climate Anxiety, Coping with the Personal Cost of Our Collective Catastrophe. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest, who is Dr. Susan Clayton. Dr. Clayton is the Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio, and her research examines the way that people think about and respond to nature and environmental issues. And she's currently writing about the effects of climate change on mental health. She's a member of the board of directors of the American Psychological Association, or APA as we call it, and previously served as the president of both the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, which is Division 9 of APA, as well as she served as president for the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology, which is Division 34 of APA. Clayton serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Environmental Psychology, Sustainability, and the Journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens, and she's the editor of the Cambridge Elements series in Applied Social Psychology. She's the lead author, or is a lead author, I should say, on a forthcoming 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And currently, this year in 21-22, she's living in Paris as a visiting fellow at the Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. So welcome, Dr. Clayton.
Thanks. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for organizing this.
Absolutely. Right. So I'll get us started with our first question for you, Susan. And I'd just like you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure. Well, I am trained as a social psychologist. And when I don't think things have changed that much, but certainly when I got did my psychology studies as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, I had no idea that the environment, natural environment, was remotely a part of psychological study or research. And a lot of people still don't know that, but I feel that I'm very lucky in having been able to combine my personal interests with my professional agenda. And not too long after I got my PhD, found a group of colleagues who are also interested in environmental issues. And we started to say, hey, we need to bring this into psychology more. Now, I don't mean to imply we were the first ones. There was definitely work out there, but nobody had told me about that work. So it definitely, it was not always well represented within psychology. So I started looking at, how people think about environmental issues, and have been doing that ever since. And perhaps relevant to mention that I was fortunate enough, although I grew up in kind of the suburbs, which I don't much like, my house happened to sit in a fairly natural area with a state park across the street and a creek running behind the house and tall trees of all types, including these big hemlocks. So, as I would lie in my bedroom at night, I could hear the creek running and I could hear the wind in the trees. And I strongly suspect that's had an influence on the way my life has turned out.
That sounds like a nice version of the suburbs.
It was an unusual version of it was the suburbs in that you couldn't walk anywhere, you couldn't get anywhere without a bus, and there was a very bad bus system, but not a typical suburban experience.
Yeah. All right. So the next question that we have for you is, and I think you already touched a little bit on this in that first response, but it's probably fair to say that most people do not immediately think of psychology when they contemplate climate change, right? They probably think about meteorology, ecology, ocean science, something like that. Why do you think psychology, or what would be your argument for why psychology is relevant to climate change?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that illustrates part of the reasons for the problems we're facing right now, which is that people think of environmental issues and environmental well-being and human well-being as kind of separate spheres. And that's certainly been embodied in a lot of the policies we have as well, that you protect nature by taking humans out of nature. And maybe you protect humans by limiting their exposure to aspects of nature. But of course, climate change is it's a problem that is due to human behavior. I mean, we could get a little bit more detailed about that, but I think I can make that general statement without pushback from you guys. And so if you want to address climate change to mitigate it, you need to think about modifying human behavior. And psychology often defines itself in part as the science of behavior. So clearly, if you're going to be engaged in behavior modification, you need to think about psychology. But two other aspects of climate change that are really relevant to psychology. One that we're all very aware of is the fact that it's so politicized that there's such an element of interpretation in how people understand climate change. So it's not something that's just, oh, here's the facts. We look at the graph that shows increasing temperatures and increasing storms and so on, and agree, yes, this is happening. People pick and choose which facts they pay attention to and which sources of information they use, and an increasingly small proportion, but nevertheless proportion of people deny that it's happening. So you have to think, well, what's going on there? And so you're thinking about cognitive processes and risk perception and social mediations of understanding. And that too is a very important psychological topic. Psychologists have been studying how people think about dangers and risks for a long time, and the role of social identity and how we respond to information. So to the extent that we need to know how people are thinking about climate change, and I think we do, we need to understand their sources of resistance, and we need to understand how you can communicate with people better. It's important to draw on the psychological research. But the third category that I think until recently, a lot of people were not thinking about at all is the idea that climate change has impacts for mental health. And nobody would deny that mental health is a domain that's relevant to psychology. So yeah, we need to be thinking about the ways in which climate change can have detrimental impacts on our mental health and our psychological well-being more generally.
Well, I think that kind of leads into what my question was. And I was wondering if you can give us a sense of the scope and nature of mental health consequences when it comes to climate change and dealing with climate change.
Absolutely. And I tend to break this down into 4 categories, although the number of categories has kind of changed the more I talk about it. So maybe I'll add another category at some point. But the first thing that I became aware of is just the fact that we know that climate change is associated with more severe extreme weather events, more hurricanes. And I think, most of us are increasingly aware of wildfires as an issue. And it's not that these didn't exist in the past, but they're intensifying and becoming more frequent with climate change. And I don't think it will surprise very many people to know that there are mental health consequences of experiencing an event like that, people who live through. Although most people are resilient, most people do not develop any mental illness following a disaster like that. You definitely see increased rates of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety, substance abuse, sleeping problems, domestic violence, all kinds of things. So that's one category, those sort of the acute impacts of climate change have a sort of direct impact on mental health. A second category is kind of the indirect effects of climate change. So it's one thing we know is that some people are going to have to move. You know, some places have already become uninhabitable or are going to become uninhabitable. And so people are displaced. And that displacement has implications for your mental health. So even, I think many of us will think of places like the Maldives, you know, low-lying islands that might be completely submerged. But even in the US, people living in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, we know that that land is eroding and vanishing, and people have already had to move. A lot of coastal communities as well. So the sort of indirect effects, perhaps of being displaced, perhaps your job is transformed by climate change, perhaps economic impacts, those can have mental health consequences. The third category that I really like to point out, because it's important and it's invisible, more or less, is that these slow changes in climate. I mean, when we think of climate change, one of the most important things is rising temperatures on average. Then we also have rising sea levels and changing patterns of precipitation, and perhaps decreasing air quality, because warmer air tends to hold more particulate matter, for example. But just to focus on heat in particular, heat, in fact, has mental health impacts. And there's anybody who's taken a social psychology course has probably heard that heat is associated with increased violence and aggression, irritability, sort of decreased social behavior. And that's really pretty well established from experimental evidence as well as correlational evidence. In the past few years, there have been a number of studies that have taken massive data sets and found that, for example, suicide rates go up in a heat wave, or in unusually high temperatures. Psychiatric hospitalizations go up on unusually high temperatures, and people are just less happy when it's hot. And there can be all kinds of reasons for this. There might be a sort of direct neurological impact. There's irritability. People are just less pleasant to be around. There's the fact that it can be difficult to sleep when it's very hot. So all of those contribute to just making heat a source of stress, and with a significant increase in mental health problems. And there's no evidence at this point that we really adapt to that. So it's not like, okay, we'll be hot for a little while and then we'll adjust. So this is something that is likely to affect people into the future as average temperatures get higher. And then the last category is the one that the title of this presentation makes reference to, which is the idea of climate anxiety. And this is something I think people have become particularly interested in, especially in the last few years, as there have been a lot of serious wildfires around the world. I mean, we've experienced them in the US, but before that, it was Australia and Portugal. I know they're at Canada this year. And the thing about wildfires is, of course, some people are directly affected, but a lot of people are not directly affected, but they're still very aware that it's happening. And especially in the wildfires this year in the US, people on the East Coast were seeing that the skies were affected by the smoke from the wildfires out west. They could see it, the impacts on the sunsets and the air quality, and people out west, sometimes being told, don't leave your house because the air quality is so bad. So climate change became visible to people in a way that it really hadn't been before, visible to a lot of people. And that makes people anxious, because to the extent that this is a real problem, maybe a lot of us, probably most of us at some level, we think, this is a problem, but I'm not going to think about it right now. But if that evidence is right there in your face, it's harder to not think about. And so that too can be a profound source of stress and anxiety that can impair. I don't mean to imply that being anxious is a sign of mental disorder. Being anxious can be very sensible, but it's a source of stress that can lead to mental health problems.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, when you were talking about the heat, just the nature of heat and how it affects us behaviorally, psychologically. I was thinking about the ways that we've tried to adapt, and you said there's not a lot of evidence that we can do it, that we can adapt well to heat. But even the methods we use, the air conditioning, it worsens our problem. So it seems almost futile or self-sabotaging to even to adapt, at least in the ways we have been. I guess the next thing that I'm thinking about, next question, is how do you define climate anxiety specifically? So you were referencing anxiety as somewhat normative, a normative response to certain pressures or experiences. But how would you characterize climate anxiety, and would you say it is mostly a rational response? And then when psychologists talk about climate anxiety, are they really only talking about anxiety, or are there other negative emotions that are wrapped up in that?
Yeah, great question. And we really, at this point, it's a term that is not being used with any precision. It's certainly not a diagnostic category. So I think, you'll hear other terms. You'll hear eco-anxiety. You'll hear climate grief, climate distress, climate change distress. When I use the term, I'm principally referencing anxiety, but there might, people do feel complex emotions. So it might include anxiety, it might include grief, it might include anger or even guilt. And then, there's a whole constellation of emotions that people might experience. When I've talked about climate anxiety, I've tried to kind of distinguish between normal levels and then levels that are potentially problematic, that actually start to interfere with your ability to function, to live your life and enjoy yourself. So I would say you can have levels of climate anxiety that are detrimental for your mental health. And that would be when you, some of the questions I've asked people is your worry about climate change interfering with your ability to sleep? Is it making it difficult for you to get your work done? Does it make it difficult for you to socialize with people? Do you find yourself crying? Those kinds of things. So I think that's the level at which climate anxiety begins to be a problem.
Hi, Dr. Clayton. So I'm wondering, isn't some amount of worry rational? And maybe are we at risk of pathologizing worry when really some worry about the state of things is important?
Hi, Davis. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think a risk, especially when psychologists get involved, because people think of psychologists as focusing on individual mental health. So if psychologists say, hey, people are anxious, it makes it sound like it's a problem of the person, when it's a problem of the society, the global society. So yeah, I think we do need to just be careful to say people are feeling climate anxiety because they're facing a serious climate problem. It might still be useful for individuals to get help dealing with their climate anxiety, but we shouldn't think that means that it's an individual problem, and it can only be effectively addressed at a kind of systemic level by addressing climate change as a society.
Hi, Dr. Clayton. My question is, recent reports, including the American Psychological Association survey on stress in America, have shown that about 50% of Americans say climate change is a source of stress for them. Do you have a sense of whether worry is more of a motivating factor or a paralyzing factor when it comes to addressing climate change?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question to ask. And I think a key question, and I don't know the answer, I'll jump to the end, but because it can be both, right? So anxiety, I think at some levels, it's like a signpost. It says, hey, there's something that you need to be paying attention to. There's a problem. And so it can be an encouragement for people to think about this issue and try to resolve it. But we've probably all been in situations where anxiety about a particular thing becomes so, so overwhelming that we become kind of paralyzed and just can't respond. And that's, certainly something that we see with clinical anxiety, that people just, they engage in repetitive rumination about the issue, and they seem to be unable to move beyond it. And to me, I always think of the deer in the headlights stuck in the middle of the road. I don't know what's really going through the deer's head, but in my mind, the deer is very anxious about the car, but so anxious that it can't decide what to do. So in some cases, your anxiety can be at a level that really inhibits, effective action. And so this is one of the questions I'm actually really interested in investigating, because as I already said, I don't know the answer. What makes the difference for when anxiety is a motivator or when it's more of a paralyzing factor? And I think, I suspect several things make a difference, one of which would be your own belief in your own ability to address the problem. So do you have some sense that you can do something? And also social support. What are other people doing? Do you feel like you will get support if you try and do something to address the problem?
Hi, my question is that there are many reasons that people are anxious about climate change, but one that I find less obvious is the growing evidence that the government inaction on climate change is contributing to anxiety, particularly in young people. And in light of this, would finding paths to address or confront the political gridlock be a wise way to reduce our anxiety?
Absolutely, and I don't know if you saw this. Let's see, I think it was just released about 10 days ago, a new study that I was fortunate to be involved in that studied young people around the world. Literally, we had 10,000 participants from 1,000 from each of 10 different countries, asking them their emotional response to climate change and also what they thought about governmental responses. And my personal reaction to the results was, I was overwhelmed by the results because they were so negative. Such a high proportion of people said not only that they were sad or angry or afraid. I mean, I think, I don't have the figures in front of me, but it was definitely majorities of people, and maybe even as high as 8 in 10 said something like sad and angry. But they endorsed statements like humanity is doomed, and that they felt that they would have fewer opportunities in their future than their parents had had. And you guys are all in this age group, so maybe you've thought some of these things as well. They also were very, very negative about governmental responses, and we asked just about governmental response in general. So we didn't want anybody to have to kind of go on record as objecting to their own government, but just the idea that what do you think about the way world governments are responding? And they were very, very negative. They were more likely to say governments are lying about the effectiveness of their action, and they were much less likely to say governments are basing their responses on the science, or they're fulfilling their job of protecting us, or they're taking our concerns seriously. So all of which is to say, absolutely, there's a lot of evidence that that young people are particularly, they feel let down by governmental response. And I think this points to something really important about climate change, which is not just an environmental problem, it's a social problem, because we have such disagreement about it, and we also have such gridlock and lack of action in terms of doing the things that we know. There are a lot of things we could be doing that we know would be effective. So I think if people felt more confidence that those in charge would take those actions, there would be less worry. And so, yes, that's a roundabout way of saying that, yes, that finding ways to get out of the political gridlock would help people, because it takes away part of the problem. You're still worried about climate change, but you're not worried about total failure, I shouldn't say total, but the general failure of those in charge.
Hi, Dr. Clayton. I have another question on those lines. With some of the far right calling today's youth Generation Snowflake and the mainstream media outlets calling climate anxiety like a pop culture trend, it seems that there might be at least some shame or embarrassment associated with climate anxiety. And I'd like to know if you think that there's any stigma in particular to anxiety about climate change.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't have any evidence about that. Do you have an opinion? I'm just curious. Do you think that people would?
I certainly do. And I think that you can use the example of individuals that are changing their diet to, help the environment. I think that there's definitely a stigma associated with individuals that are trying to eliminate meat and dairy from their diet, and that possibly having some negative connotations in terms of them being like strong enough, or have like maybe some of the misogynistic types of traits that maybe go along with a very intense meat eating diet. So I do think that on that case, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right in particular about the sort of gendered aspect of this, that at least in American society, I'll say we think that talking about your emotions in general is a more female thing to do, and so therefore it's a weaker thing to do, and it's kind of surprising to me. Well, it's not surprising, but it's ironic, because I think people who are willing to face up to the fact that we're in a scary situation are actually showing greater strength than the ones who are in denial. But yeah, there is that sense that associated with the show no pain, do not admit that you're suffering, do not admit that the planet is suffering. And there is some evidence that, people consider expressing environmental concern to be a more feminine thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be something where you open yourself up to a bit of ridicule, or potentially from certain folks, that if you admit to being concerned about climate change, or even go further and say, I'm personally anxious about it and it's causing me a high level of anxiety that may even be impairing my ability to function, that would be it would open yourself up to ridicule, unfortunately, which is another source of anxiety, right? Anticipating that. So
absolutely. And it's not just that we don't encourage people to talk about their feelings. We also have there's a stigma associated with, mental illness and with admitting things like depression and so on. So it may be part of that package as well. I like to think that might be reducing a little bit. I have, because I feel like during the pandemic, so many people were aware of mental health problems that it became, we realized that you couldn't hold an individual to account for their own mental health problems. You had to recognize the situation they were dealing with. So hopefully we're becoming a little bit more open to people admitting to anxiety, but we probably still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult to give specific behavioral recommendations for general audiences, but can you offer some general advice for people on how they might take steps to reduce their own climate anxiety?
Absolutely. And first, I would just say that for people who are experiencing extreme anxiety, the prescriptions might be different. You might want to, seek help from a therapist. Definitely want to think about just ways of coming to terms with your emotional response. Maybe, stop following the news, step away from the media, go for a walk, preferably in a forest. So definitely when the anxiety is at a really high level, you just want to get on top of that emotional response first. But for people who are feeling more moderate levels of climate anxiety, I think I would recommend three things. And the first is to get informed. And one reason I say that is that anxiety is associated with uncertainty. And unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to climate change. We know that the climate is changing, but I can't say there are going to be 3 times as many storms in Massachusetts in 2065. We don't have that level of detail of who's going to experience what effects. But there is more information than a lot of people have. So getting some more specific information. I mean, there are people who are saying we're all doomed and the planet is going to burn up. That's probably not true, at least not in the foreseeable future. So finding out, well, what exactly is going to happen in my area? What are the risks? What are the changes that I might see? That might demystify it a little bit and give you what's called cognitive control. So even though you don't really have control over the situation, you feel a little bit more in control just because you understand it a little bit better. Second important thing is to get connected to other people. We know that social connections in general, regardless of the issues, social connections are really important in enabling people to be resilient. And that's certainly true when it comes to climate anxiety as well. So connecting to other people, perhaps who can kind of support and validate your concerns so you don't feel so alone, perhaps just the opportunity to share your response, your emotions. I think that can be very powerful. And sometimes those occasions when you get together with these other people, they can be a source of positive emotions. They can be fun, they can be empowering, a lot of good things. So connect with other people who are also concerned. And then my third recommendation is to get active, because again, that's another way of regaining some control over the situation. You might think this is terrible. The world is going to change in some negative ways, but I'm not just going to sit here and passively accept it. I'm going to do what I can. And that can be, I don't want to say that everybody has to go out there and be a climate activist. It might just involve taking charge of your own household in some ways, saying, what can I do within my household to make sure that I'm protected from, whatever it be, floods or wildfires or storms, or what can I do within my own household to try and reduce my use of fossil fuels? Then it could be at the community level, like, can I form a community group or a campus group, to try and help see how we can transform this group, this community, to confront the realities that climate change is presenting to us. And then, of course, political activism, it's not for everybody, but it's very important. So that can be a really useful way of getting involved too, forming a political group, contacting elected officials or perhaps businesses and corporations to ask them to change their actions. And it's certainly not easy to get political change, but it's also not impossible. And there are all kinds of success stories. So, you go out there and you say, I want to change what my campus is doing. I want to change what my community is doing. And maybe you'll succeed. That can be really helpful in addressing climate anxiety.
To actually piggyback on that, so do you have any advice, be it reducing climate anxiety, addressing lack of political will, or confronting climate change more generally for students like us here at FIT?
Yeah, good question. I think all of the things I just said would apply. And I know it's true for a lot of people, but it tends to be particularly true for students that you have a lot going on in your life. And I remember being a student and, it's like, I don't have time to think about political events because I'm preparing for my exams. Or there was a sense that just you have to put all of wider society on hold sometime. So giving yourself a break might be one of the most important bits of advice. I think perhaps especially for students, there's a sense in which I think at this stage in your life, a lot of students are kind of deciding who they want to be, whether, and that is of course an occupation, but it's also like, well, what am I going to prioritize in my life? What values am I going to try and express? How am I going to support myself? All of these are questions about identity, and to think, and I have to add saving the world on top of that can be just kind of a little bit overwhelming. So even though it's important to recognize that we can all do something, don't feel that you have to do everything. And honestly, I think one of the most useful ways of dealing with a problem like this, it may involve a little tiny bit of denial as well, but just say, I'm going to find some things that I can do, and I'm going to do them. And then I'm just going to let myself off the hook and for the other things. And then maybe, gradually you might do more and more, but combining that willingness to address the problem with also an acknowledgement that it's okay to have a life in addition to this problem.
I think that's excellent advice. I think as very particularly to FIT students too, one advantage is that you're all in New York City, and there are so many organizations here and ways to plug in, on campus for sure, but definitely in the wider city. And Dr. Clayton was talking about getting involved locally as maybe a way to feel more efficacious, right? Instead of just paying attention to federal elections. There's so much that can happen locally in our community, and you can really feel like you're having an impact because you are. And that sort of social component, you make friends, you enjoy yourself while you're saving the world. and just kind of that whole, Susan, when you were talking about, all the things that college students normally grapple with, and kind of the challenges of that stage of life. And then for this particular generation, kind of the idea of, Atlas with the world, collectively Atlas with the world on their shoulders. It's no surprise that, you're getting the kinds of results that you talked about in the survey across the cross-national surveys, showing that young people are so anxious about this. But knowing that there are opportunities to sort of plug in and get involved and kind of step back a little bit and say, what can I do in my local community, on my campus, that will make incremental change, I think is a really important kind of mind switch to make. Yeah. Yeah,
and you all, I think it may be hard to recognize this, but you're at a actually particularly powerful stage in your lives, because you're in a transition period from an earlier way of being to a later way of being, and it's much easier to make changes at that point. And that's not only true for at least most of you as individuals, but it's kind of true for us as a society. I think the pandemic upended so many things, so many typical behaviors, that it allows this space for us to change the way we do things. I mean, something as simple as like eating outdoors at restaurants. I love eating outdoors at a restaurant, and it's much more easy than it was before the pandemic, because there was all that time when that was the only possibility. I'm not saying that was a significant change from a climate point of view, but it's just an example of how these moments of upheaval can lead to actual improvements. And so recognizing that you're in that transition zone can hopefully make you feel, to recognize the power that you have to make decisions that will carry on into the future.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think too, the kinds of industries that our students, many students go into here when they graduate, are the kinds of industries that really are ripe for change. They need to change, desperately need to change to address climate change, but they also seem receptive to it. And so that's kind of maybe I'm too optimistic about that, but that's my perspective from afar of some of the industries. So I think that gives you additional power as well to make a difference.
Absolutely. And you guys are in the kind of trend-setting capital of the world. Maybe some other cities would disagree, but I'm going to give it to you. And so I think people often focus on, well, what can I do as an individual? And it seems so limited, but one of the things everybody can do is influence other people. And So you have the potential to establish models that, maybe you'll influence 5 other people or 10 other people, or maybe you'll influence tens of thousands of other people because, what you do will get noticed and will change kind of typical patterns of behavior. And, New York, you're already living more sustainably than a lot of people, because people who are living in a big city don't use as many resources as people who are living out in the suburbs. So you can show other people how to be more sustainable.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Caroline, did you have something?
I want to mention something too, really quickly on that, if you don't mind. I just find it so interesting talking about what we can do as students at FIT, because so many of our programs are immersed in textiles and what textiles means for pollution in the world, using alternative materials, of course, but also just like textile science and moving it forward and showing interest, and even just simply looking up, web searches and showing interest in those alternative materials, I think are going to substantially help our impact on the environment and can ease some of that anxiety. So I just wanted to mention that, the textiles at FIT and that whole realm is definitely worth diving into and seeing where we can make a change. But just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think I want to just highlight what you said about showing interest, because if you ask your faculty, hey, tell us more about this topic, they'll start to notice. So that can be a way you don't have to have the answer. You just asking the question can make a difference. And it's obviously something I don't know very much about is textiles, but I've been hearing really interesting things about, mushroom-based substances, for example. So yeah, I think what Dr. Benkendorf was saying, it's a good time to think about some significant changes.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, it's interesting to see all of the intersections when you think about environmentalism, either psychology or fashion, gender studies. And I'm actually working on my senior thesis right now, and I'm trying to really make it an interdisciplinary project, because it is fascinating to kind of merge all of these realms of thought together. I know that this conversation has been centered around, the negative psychological impacts of climate change, but you could kind of subvert that in a way and think about how healing the planet could lead to positive mental health impacts. I don't know if you have any resources on that while I'm completing my research, but I specifically want to look at how gardening and composting, so kind of having that tangible immersive experience in nature can improve or help someone who suffers from depression or anxiety. So yeah,
I'm really glad you asked that. Because this is one of the things that I hope will be true as we start to think about the need to change our way of life. I mean, I think most of us, probably all of us, would acknowledge that life was not perfect, 10 years ago. So the pandemic has prompted us to change some things, but climate change is also prompting us to change some things. And the changes we make might be good changes, that they're not just about addressing climate change, but they're about having a better life. I think that a lot of people are becoming more aware of the importance of nature and interactions with the natural world. And if climate change encourages us to spend more time gardening and to ride our bikes more than driving our cars, those are going to have benefits that have nothing to do with climate change. Those are just things that will make us happier and give our lives, more richness. And I think one of the things that people definitely talk about when it comes to climate change is finding meaning in addressing it. And it can be very satisfying to think, well, here's a real problem and I am going to be part of the solution. I mean, that's a kind of a fabulous feeling. So the things we want or the things we need to make a happy life are not just, oh, I need life to be easy. I need life to be meaningful. I need to feel like my work has value. And so I think there are lots of opportunities for you all to find ways of finding that that meaning and purpose.
Great. Anyone else have something else you want to ask Dr. Clayton? No?
I have a question that's kind of unrelated to, what our recently just talking about, but I'm curious to know if in your work and as of recently in the last, year and a half that we've been going through the pandemic, if you've noticed kind of a correlation between, a response to COVID and the pandemic and climate anxiety, and if you think people and their reaction to COVID has any correlation to like how they react to climate change also, if you think like it might be helpful or hurtful.
Yeah, I have some data that I haven't yet had a chance to fully explore that looks at that. I can say that people who feel climate anxiety are more likely to also feel COVID anxiety. And I think that's, partly some people respond more emotionally. But there are differences as well that I need to explore more. I think there have been a number of articles written about what does COVID tell us about climate change, or what can we learn about dealing with climate change from thinking about COVID. So there are some really interesting kind of parallels and resonances there.
Yeah, I know it's come up a lot in conversations and in my classes with students showing concern about just the additional waste, right? The disposable masks and we used to bring our reusable cup into the Starbucks, and then they won't allow us to do that. So there's just there seems to be more packaged things to protect against pathogens. So I've heard, it's anecdotal, but I've heard a lot of concern about that among people who are concerned about the environment. So it'd be interesting to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, it was so hard for me when I had to stop taking my reusable bags to the grocery store. Every plastic bag that I carried home just felt like a blow. I got over it. You have to, but yeah, I think about that as well. There are a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
Has there been any like research or data on the effect COVID had on the planet with like all the waste that came from it or is still coming from it?
I haven't seen, I bet there has been, but I haven't seen one with regard to waste. I've seen in terms of energy use, though, there was actual reduction, but it's fairly temporary. So nobody really expects it to make much difference, but maybe at least that helps to balance out the additional garbage we generated.
We might have generated a substantial amount of garbage in like the medical field, hospitals and medical facilities, nursing homes. They might have generated quite a bit more trash during this pandemic, but that's just, one industry possibly. Maybe transportation industry had to waste a lot more. But yeah, that's an interesting take.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that we've seen covered in the news is just at least with the pandemic, you have that now this powerful illustration of the human impact on climate systems and on wildlife and on air quality, right? Just those iconic images of a clear day in April in Beijing, right? April 2020, and it's a really powerful image to be able to show, when we talk about it. But yeah, I agree. We've reverted. We've gone right back, but at least we have those images now to show pretty powerfully the cause-effect relationship between what we do and all these systems.
Yeah, and it was really interesting, again, back in spring of 2020, how many people wanted to talk about that, the true stories, but also the fake stories about the wildlife returning to the cities. I think it showed that people felt like, it was a sign that the planet could heal. And so that was something people thought about with optimism at a time when we didn't have a whole lot of optimism.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of you. Thank my students, FIT students here for joining us, and big thank you to you, Dr. Clayton, for your expertise and bringing it here to our campus. And we wish you well in your year in Paris, and look forward to seeing more of what you're up to in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, and thanks for the really interesting discussion. You guys have great questions, and I hope you have a good year.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Clayton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.